Sarah Martinez had always been the quiet one in her Navy unit. While her fellow sailors boasted about their missions over beers at the base bar, she preferred to sit in the corner, nursing a Coke, and listening to their stories with an enigmatic smile. Her reserved nature had earned her the nickname Ghost among her peers, though none of them knew just how fitting that moniker truly was. At 28 years old, Sarah had spent the last decade serving her country with unwavering dedication. Her personnel file read like a standard Navy career: multiple deployments, commendations for exceptional service, and a spotless record. What the file didn't reveal was the shadow world she had operated in, far from the conventional battles her shipmates knew about. The evening started like any other Friday night at the Anchor's Rest, the popular off-base establishment where Navy personnel gathered to unwind. The dimly lit bar buzzed with conversations about upcoming deployments, family back home, and the usual military gossip. Sarah sat at her usual corner table, observing the familiar faces around her. She had learned long ago that watching and listening often revealed more than talking ever could. Petty Officer Jake Morrison slammed his empty beer bottle on the wooden table, causing the others to look up from their conversations. Jake was known for his loud personality and even louder stories. Tonight was no different as he launched into another tale about his time aboard the USS Thunderbolt during a counter-piracy operation off the coast of Somalia. So there I was, manning the 50 cal on the bow. Jake gestured wildly with his hands, recreating the scene for his captivated audience. These pirates came at us in their little speedboat, thinking they could take on the United States Navy. Big mistake. He paused for dramatic effect, taking a swig from his fresh beer. I lit them up like the 4th of July. Had to be at least 6 confirmed kills that day. The table erupted in cheers and backslapping. Stories like these were common currency in their circle, each sailor trying to outdo the others with tales of their combat prowess. Sarah had heard variations of Jake's story countless times, and she suspected the number of confirmed kills grew with each telling. Seaman Rodriguez, barely 21 and fresh from his first deployment, leaned forward eagerly. "That's incredible, Jake. I've only got 2 confirmed kills from that engagement in the Gulf last month." His voice carried a mixture of pride and disappointment, as if 2 lives taken wasn't enough to earn respect among his peers. The conversation continued around the table as each sailor shared their combat statistics. It was a macabre scorekeeping that Sarah had never participated in, despite the numerous opportunities. She understood the psychology behind it. Young men and women trying to process the reality of taking lives in service to their country by turning it into a competition, a game with points and bragging rights. Lieutenant Commander Hayes, the senior officer present, and someone Sarah had served under during her last deployment, raised his glass. "To our fallen enemies," he declared with military precision. "May they serve as a reminder to anyone who threatens American interests." The toast was echoed around the table, though Sarah noticed she wasn't the only one who seemed uncomfortable with the casual celebration of death. As the evening progressed, and the alcohol flowed more freely, the stories became increasingly embellished. Jake's 6 kills had somehow grown to 8, and Rodriguez's 2 had become 3 with a possible 4th. Sarah watched this familiar ritual with the detached interest of someone who had seen too much to be impressed by such displays. It was Chief Petty Officer Williams who finally noticed Sarah's silence. Williams was a 20-year veteran with graying hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He had a reputation for being tough but fair, and his word carried significant weight among the enlisted personnel. "Hey, Ghost," Williams called out, using her nickname with the casual familiarity of someone who had served alongside her for years. "You've been awfully quiet tonight. What's your count?" The question was asked with genuine curiosity rather than challenge, but it had the effect of focusing the entire table's attention on Sarah. The conversation died down as all eyes turned to her. Sarah felt the weight of their expectant gazes, knowing that her answer would inevitably disappoint them. She had no intention of revealing the true nature of her service record, the classified missions that didn't officially exist, or the specialized training that had transformed her from a regular sailor into something far more dangerous. "I don't really keep track," she said quietly, hoping to deflect their attention back to their own stories. It was a truthful statement in its way. She had stopped counting long ago when the numbers became too heavy to bear. Jake laughed loudly, the sound carrying across the noisy bar. "Come on, Ghost. Everyone keeps track. It's impossible not to. The first one stays with you forever, and after that, you count them like notches on a belt." His words were slurred slightly from the alcohol, but his meaning was clear. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat, taking a small sip of her Coke to buy herself time. She could feel the expectation building around the table, the assumption that she was either being modest or had nothing impressive to share. Neither assumption was correct, but she couldn't explain that without revealing information that would put everyone in the room at risk. Rodriguez leaned across the table, his young face eager with curiosity. Seriously, Sarah, you've been deployed more times than any of us. You had to have seen some action. His use of her real name instead of her nickname suggested a genuine desire to include her in their brotherhood of combat veterans. The truth was that Sarah had seen more action than all of them combined, but it wasn't the kind of action that could be discussed in a crowded bar or documented in official reports. Her deployments had taken her to places that didn't appear on any map, on missions that required skills far beyond what the standard Navy training provided. Chief Williams studied her with those keen eyes, and Sarah wondered if he suspected there was more to her story than her personnel file suggested. He had been around long enough to recognize when someone was holding back, and his expression suggested he was beginning to put together pieces of a puzzle he hadn't realized existed. Maybe she's just being humble, suggested Petty Officer Thompson, a woman in her mid-30s who had joined their group earlier in the evening. Some of us don't feel the need to broadcast our service record to every sailor in the bar. Her tone carried a subtle criticism of the men's competitive storytelling, and Sarah felt grateful for the attempted deflection. But Jake was persistent, emboldened by alcohol and the attention of his audience. Nah, I think our ghost here just doesn't have any stories worth telling. Probably spent all her deployments in the engine room or something. His words were meant as good-natured ribbing, but they stung more than he realized. Sarah had spent years perfecting the art of blending into the background, of being unremarkable and forgettable. It was a skill that had served her well in her covert operations, but it also meant that her fellow sailors often underestimated her capabilities. She was fine with that arrangement most of the time, but tonight something in Jake's dismissive tone rankled her. The bar around them continued its usual Friday night chaos, with conversations and laughter creating a constant din that provided cover for their discussion. Sarah noticed a group of Marines at a nearby table who had been listening to their conversation with obvious amusement. The inter-service rivalry between Navy and Marines was legendary, and she could see they were enjoying the spectacle of sailors trying to one-up each other with war stories. Lieutenant Commander Hayes, perhaps sensing the growing tension, attempted to steer the conversation in a different direction. You know, it's not always about the numbers, he said diplomatically. Some of the most valuable contributions happen behind the scenes, in ways that don't involve direct combat. His words were clearly intended to give Sarah an honorable exit from the uncomfortable situation. But the damage was done. The expectation hung in the air like smoke, and Sarah realized that her continued evasion would only fuel more speculation and potentially unwanted attention. She had always been careful to maintain her cover, to appear as ordinary and unremarkable as possible. But sometimes, she thought, the best way to hide was in plain sight. Williams wasn't ready to let the subject drop. His experience had taught him to pay attention when someone didn't fit the expected pattern, and Sarah's reluctance to share her combat experiences was clearly bothering him. Come on, Martinez, he said, using her last name with military formality. We're all friends here. What's the harm in sharing a sea story or two? The question hung in the air as Sarah weighed her options. She could continue to deflect, risking more suspicion and attention, or she could give them something to satisfy their curiosity. The problem was that any story she could tell truthfully would raise more questions than it answered. Jake, sensing victory in her hesitation, leaned back in his chair with a satisfied grin. I knew it, he declared triumphantly. All that mysterious quiet act, and she's probably never even fired her weapon in anger. The statement was meant to be the final word on the subject, a dismissal that would allow them to move on to other topics. It was Rodriguez who inadvertently changed everything. Still drunk on his own limited combat experience, and eager to be accepted by the more experienced sailors, he decided to press the issue further. Maybe we should make it interesting, he suggested with the reckless confidence of youth. How about we all write down our kill counts, and see who comes out on top? The suggestion was met with mixed reactions around the table. Some of the sailors seemed enthusiastic about the idea, while others looked uncomfortable with the prospect of turning their combat experiences into a formal competition. Chief Williams frowned at the suggestion, clearly recognizing the potential for problems. But before he could object, Jake had already pulled out a napkin and was scribbling numbers. Great idea, kid, Jake said approvingly. Let's see who the real warriors are in this group. He folded his napkin and placed it in the center of the table, challenging the others to follow suit. Sarah watched the proceedings with growing unease. What had started as casual bragging was evolving into something more formal and potentially dangerous. She knew that putting numbers on paper, even on bar napkins, could create problems if the wrong people saw them. Military personnel were supposed to be discreet about their combat activities, especially when alcohol was involved. Thompson was the first to voice objection to the informal competition. This is getting ridiculous, she said firmly. We're not keeping score in some video game. These are real people's lives we're talking about. Her words carried the moral weight that many of the others seemed to have forgotten in their alcohol-fueled bravado. But the momentum had already built beyond easy stopping. Rodriguez had written his number and placed it beside Jake's, and peer pressure was mounting for others to follow. Even Hayes seemed caught between his role as a senior officer and his desire to maintain camaraderie with his subordinates. Sarah realized she was at a crossroads. She could refuse to participate and risk drawing even more attention to herself, or she could play along with a number that would satisfy their curiosity without revealing too much. Neither option appealed to her, but she had learned long ago that sometimes the best choice was the least bad option available. The conversation had attracted attention from other tables in the bar, and Sarah noticed several groups of servicemen watching their table with interest. Word was spreading about the informal kill count competition, and she could see phone cameras being discreetly positioned to capture the results. What had started as a private conversation among shipmates was becoming a very public spectacle. Williams finally stepped in with the authority of his rank and experience. All right, that's enough, he declared firmly. This has gone too far. We're not doing this here, and we're not doing this now. His tone carried the finality of a direct order, even though they were off-duty and off-base. But Jake, emboldened by alcohol and unwilling to back down from what he saw as a challenge to his storytelling supremacy, decided to push one final time. Come on, Chief. Don't let Ghost off the hook just because she doesn't want to admit she's never actually been in a real fight. The words were spoken with the casual cruelty of someone who had never considered that he might be wrong. The insult hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah felt something shift inside her. She had spent years accepting underestimation as a useful tool, allowing others to dismiss her as unremarkable and harmless. But something about Jake's casual dismissal, combined with the expectant faces around the table, triggered a response she hadn't planned. Looking directly at Jake with eyes that suddenly seemed much older than her 28 years, Sarah spoke in a voice that was quiet but carried clearly across the table. You really want to know? She asked, and something in her tone made the entire group fall silent. The question hung in the air as the Friday night chaos of the bar continued around them, but at their table, time seemed suspended. Sarah could see the anticipation in their faces, the assumption that she was finally ready to admit to a modest count that would pale in comparison to their inflated stories. Jake nodded eagerly, still confident in his position as the evening's champion storyteller. Yeah, Ghost. We really want to know. What's your kill count? Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would change everything. The secret she had carried for years, the missions that officially didn't exist, and the training that had transformed her into something far more dangerous than any of them could imagine. It was all about to come to light in the most unexpected way possible. The moment stretched out as she considered her options one final time. But the decision had already been made when Jake decided to push too far and question not just her experience, but her courage and her service to her country. 347, she said quietly. The number fell into the sudden silence like a stone into still water, and Sarah watched as the implications began to register on the faces around the table. The casual atmosphere of military braggadocio evaporated instantly, replaced by something much more serious and potentially dangerous. She had just revealed a number that would make even the most experienced special operations veteran pause in consideration. A number that suggested a level of combat experience that went far beyond conventional naval service. A number that would inevitably raise questions she wasn't prepared to answer. The silence stretched on as each person at the table processed what they had just heard, and Sarah realized that her carefully maintained cover was about to be blown wide open by a casual conversation in a crowded bar. Jake's confident smile faded as the number sank in, replaced by confusion and disbelief. Rodriguez looked like he had been slapped, his own modest count suddenly seeming trivial in comparison. Even Chief Williams sat back in his chair, his experienced eyes studying Sarah with newfound interest and concern. Lieutenant Commander Hayes was the first to speak, his voice carefully controlled. That's quite a number, Martinez. Are you certain about that count? Sarah met his gaze steadily, knowing there was no going back now. I'm certain, she replied, and the quiet conviction in her voice left no room for doubt about the truth of her statement. The evening had taken a turn that none of them had expected, and Sarah realized that her quiet life as an unassuming sailor was about to become much more complicated. The secret world she had operated in was about to collide with her cover identity in ways that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. As she looked around the table at the shocked faces of her fellow sailors, Sarah wondered if telling the truth had been the right choice, or if she had just made a mistake that would haunt her for the rest of her career. The number hung in the air between them like an unexploded bomb, waiting to detonate and change everything they thought they knew about the quiet woman they called Ghost. The silence at the table stretched on for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 seconds. Sarah could hear the normal sounds of the bar continuing around them, glasses clinking, conversations from other tables, the distant sound of a television broadcasting a baseball game. But at their table, the atmosphere had changed completely. Jake was the first to break the silence, but his usual bravado was gone. 347, he repeated slowly, as if saying the number out loud might make it less real. That's not possible. That's more than entire Unit C in a full deployment. Sarah remained silent, already regretting her decision to reveal the truth. She had spent years perfecting the art of being unremarkable, of blending into the background and avoiding attention. In a moment of irritation, she had thrown away a decade of careful operational security. Rodriguez was staring at her with wide eyes, his young face struggling to process what he had heard. But that would mean. He trailed off, unable to complete the thought. His own 2 confirmed kills, which had seemed so significant just minutes before, now felt insignificant by comparison. Chief Williams leaned forward, his experienced eyes studying Sarah with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. Martinez, I've been in the Navy for 20 years. I've served in 3 wars, and more conflicts than I can count. I know sailors who've spent their entire careers in combat zones, and none of them have numbers like that. The statement hung in the air like an accusation, though Williams' tone remained carefully neutral. Sarah could see the questions forming in his mind, the same questions that would inevitably come from others once word of this conversation spread beyond their table. Lieutenant Commander Hayes had recovered from his initial shock and was now studying Sarah with the analytical mind of a senior officer. She could see him running through possibilities, trying to reconcile the quiet sailor he knew with the implications of the number she had given them. Where? Hayes asked simply. Where did you serve that would result in that level of combat engagement? It was the question Sarah had been dreading, because any honest answer would reveal information that was still classified at levels far above any of their security clearances. The missions she had been part of officially didn't exist, carried out by units that weren't supposed to be there, in countries that the United States wasn't supposed to be operating in. I can't discuss the details, Sarah replied quietly. Much of my service record is classified. It was a truthful statement, but she knew it would only fuel more speculation rather than satisfying their curiosity. Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it. Classified? Come on, Ghost. We all have classified elements in our service records. But 347 kills? That's not classified, that's fantasy. The accusation of lying stung more than Sarah expected it to. She had told the truth for the first time in years, and now she was being accused of fabrication by someone whose own stories grew more embellished with each telling. Thompson, who had been quiet since the number was revealed, finally spoke up. If that number is real, she said slowly, then you're not just Navy. You're something else entirely. Her words carried a recognition that the others seemed to be missing, that such a kill count suggested involvement in operations far beyond conventional naval service. The conversation was beginning to attract attention from nearby tables. Other servicemen were starting to look their way, drawn by the intense atmosphere and hushed voices. Sarah realized that what should have remained a private revelation was becoming increasingly public, with all the risks that entailed. Williams was still studying her with those sharp eyes. I've heard rumors, he said quietly. Stories about Navy personnel who get pulled for special assignments. Assignments that don't appear on any official records. His words were carefully chosen, probing for information without directly asking questions that might compromise operational security. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. If Williams was connecting dots, others would too. The careful separation between her cover identity and her real mission assignments was beginning to break down, and she wasn't sure how to stop it. Hayes leaned forward, lowering his voice so that their conversation wouldn't carry to other tables. Martinez, if what you're saying is true, then we need to have a different conversation. Not here, and not now, but soon. The implication was clear. Hayes suspected that Sarah's revelation had national security implications that went far beyond a casual conversation among shipmates. He was right, of course, but that didn't make the situation any less dangerous for everyone involved. Rodriguez was still struggling to process what he had heard. But how is that even possible, he asked. I mean, logistically, 347 separate engagements? That would take years. It did, Sarah replied simply, then immediately regretted giving even that small additional detail. Every piece of information she revealed was another thread that could be pulled to unravel her carefully constructed cover story. Jake had been quiet for several minutes, but now he leaned back in his chair with a skeptical expression. I think you're full of shit, he declared loudly enough to be heard at neighboring tables. Nobody has numbers like that. Not even Delta Force or SEAL's claim counts that high. His words carried across the bar, and Sarah noticed several Marine personnel at nearby tables turning to look at their group with obvious interest. Military personnel were always curious about special operations claims, and Jake's loud skepticism was drawing exactly the kind of attention she had spent years avoiding. Keep your voice down, Williams ordered sharply, but the damage was already done. The conversation had gone from private to semi-public, and Sarah could see people at other tables straining to hear more details. Hayes stood up abruptly. This conversation is over, he declared with the authority of his rank. We're not discussing classified information in a public bar. His words were clearly intended to shut down further speculation, but Sarah suspected it was too late to contain the situation. Thompson looked at Sarah with a mixture of curiosity and concern. If that number is real, you should be careful who you share it with, she said quietly. There are people who might want to know how you acquired that kind of experience. The warning was well-intentioned, but it came too late. Sarah had already revealed far more than she should have, and she was beginning to understand the full implications of her momentary lapse in judgment. The group began to disperse, but Sarah noticed that several of them were making phone calls as they left the bar. Word would spread quickly through the base, and by morning, her revelation would be common knowledge among the enlisted personnel. From there, it would inevitably reach the attention of people who had the resources and authority to investigate her claims. As Sarah drove back to base that night, she tried to calculate how much time she had before her carefully constructed cover began to unravel completely. Her commanding officers would want answers, and those answers would lead to questions about missions that were supposed to remain buried in classified files. The next morning arrived with the harsh reality of what her revelation had set in motion. Sarah's phone buzzed with text messages from fellow sailors, some expressing admiration, others demanding more details, and a few warning her that her claims were being discussed throughout the base. She arrived at her duty station to find Chief Williams waiting for her, his expression serious and professional. Martinez, my office. Now, the small office was cramped and functional, with Williams' 20 years of service represented by the various plaques and photographs covering the walls. He gestured for her to sit, then closed the door and activated a white noise generator, a device typically used when discussing sensitive information. Start talking, Williams said without preamble. And don't tell me it's classified. I've been around long enough to know when someone is operating under a different set of rules than the rest of us. Sarah weighed her options carefully. Williams was a senior enlisted man with significant experience and a security clearance that might allow for at least partial disclosure. But she also knew that any information she shared would inevitably be reported up the chain of command. I can't discuss the specifics of my assignments, she replied carefully, but I can confirm that my service record includes elements that aren't reflected in my standard personnel file. Williams nodded, as if this confirmation matched his own suspicions. I figured as much. Nobody develops that level of expertise through conventional Navy service. He paused, studying her face. The question is, what happens now that the cat's out of the bag? It was a question Sarah had been asking herself since the previous evening. Her cover identity as an unremarkable sailor had been one of her most valuable assets, allowing her to blend into the regular Navy population between special assignments. That cover was now compromised, possibly beyond repair. I don't know, she admitted honestly. This wasn't supposed to happen. Williams leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. You know what troubles me most about this whole situation? It's not the number. Hell, I've heard rumors about operators with counts that high. What troubles me is that you're here, serving as a regular sailor, when someone with your background should be somewhere entirely different. His observation was uncomfortably accurate. Sarah's presence in a conventional Navy unit was itself an anomaly that careful observers might notice. She was supposed to be maintaining her cover identity, but her actual skills and experience were far beyond what her position required. A knock on the office door interrupted their conversation. Williams called for entry, and Lieutenant Commander Hayes stepped inside, his expression serious and professional. Behind him was a man Sarah didn't recognize, a civilian in an expensive suit who carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority. Chief, we need to borrow Petty Officer Martinez for a few hours, Hayes said formally. His use of her rank rather than her name suggested this was an official matter rather than a casual conversation. The civilian stepped forward, producing credentials that identified him as a representative of Naval Intelligence. Ms. Martinez, I'm Agent Morrison. We need to discuss your service record and some statements you made last evening. Sarah felt her stomach drop. Naval Intelligence involvement meant that her revelation had attracted attention at levels far above the base command structure. Whatever protection her classified status had provided was clearly insufficient to shield her from this level of scrutiny. Williams looked concerned, but unsurprised. Sir, with respect, Petty Officer Martinez is under my command. I'd like to know what this is about before she goes anywhere. Agent Morrison's smile was professional, but cold. I'm afraid that's not possible, Chief. This matter involves classified information at levels above your clearance. Ms. Martinez will be returned to duty once we've completed our conversation. The dismissal was polite, but final. Williams could only nod and step aside as Sarah was escorted from his office. As they walked through the base corridors, she noticed other personnel watching with obvious curiosity. Word had indeed spread quickly, and her movement under Naval Intelligence escort would only fuel more speculation. The conference room they entered was secure, with soundproofing and electronic countermeasures designed to prevent eavesdropping. Agent Morrison was joined by two other officials, a Navy captain and another civilian who identified himself only as Mr. Smith. Ms. Martinez, Agent Morrison began once the room was secured. Last evening you claimed to have 347 confirmed kills. That's a very specific number, and it's attracted some attention in certain circles. Sarah remained silent, knowing that anything she said at this point could potentially compromise ongoing operations or endanger other personnel involved in her previous missions. The Navy captain leaned forward. We've reviewed your official service record. While it shows multiple deployments and commendations for exceptional service, there's nothing that would account for the level of combat engagement you've claimed. That's because the relevant portions of my service are classified under programs that don't appear in standard personnel files, Sarah replied carefully. Mr. Smith opened a file folder and spread several documents across the table. Even from her position, Sarah could see that they contained information that was supposed to be buried in the deepest levels of the classified system. We know about your real assignments, Smith said quietly. What we want to understand is why you chose to reveal information about them in a public setting. The question went to the heart of Sarah's dilemma. She couldn't explain that years of maintaining her cover identity had created a psychological pressure that finally exploded when her service was questioned and dismissed. She couldn't admit that she had simply reached a breaking point after enduring years of being underestimated and overlooked. It was a mistake, she said simply. I allowed personal feelings to override operational security. Agent Morrison nodded as if this explanation matched his own assessment. Mistakes have consequences, Ms. Martinez. Your revelation has created ripple effects that go far beyond your base. There are people asking questions now that we'd prefer they didn't ask. The implication was clear. Sarah's moment of honesty had potentially compromised not just her own operations, but those of others as well. The special programs she had been part of depended on secrecy and deniability, both of which were now at risk. Captain Reynolds spoke for the first time. We have several options for how to proceed. None of them are particularly good for your career, but some are better than others. Sarah waited for him to continue, knowing that her choices were likely to be limited and unpleasant. Option 1, Reynolds continued, is transferred to a new assignment under a different identity. Your current cover is blown, but we can create a new one. The downside is that you'd have to start over completely. New history, new relationships, new life. The prospect of abandoning everything she had built over the past several years was daunting, but Sarah recognized it might be the least bad option available. Option 2, Smith interjected, is to bring you in from the cold, so to speak. Assign you to a position that matches your actual qualifications and experience. The problem is that doing so would confirm the legitimacy of your claims and potentially expose the programs you've been part of. Both options had serious drawbacks, and Sarah suspected there were additional consequences that weren't being discussed. People who knew too much about classified operations sometimes found their career options limited in ways that weren't immediately apparent. Agent Morrison closed his file folder and looked directly at Sarah. Before you decide, there's something else you need to know. Your revelation last night wasn't the random conversation you thought it was. Jake Morrison, the sailor who was pushing you for information, he's not what he seems to be either. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Jake Morrison, Agent Morrison. The coincidence was too convenient to be accidental, and she realized that her cover had been under investigation long before the previous evening's conversation. He's my nephew, Agent Morrison continued, and he's been tasked with identifying personnel who might be operating under false identities or cover stories. Your reaction to his questioning confirmed suspicions that had been building for months. Sarah felt the full weight of how thoroughly she had been manipulated. What she had thought was a spontaneous moment of anger and truth-telling had actually been a carefully orchestrated operation designed to force her to reveal herself. The room fell silent as she processed this information. Her carefully maintained cover hadn't been blown by a moment of poor judgment. It had been deliberately compromised by an investigation that had been ongoing without her knowledge. Why? She asked finally. If you already suspected, why the elaborate setup? Captain Reynolds answered. Because we needed confirmation, and we needed it in a way that would be believable to outside observers. If we had simply pulled you in for questioning, it would have looked like we were investigating our own people without cause. This way, your revelation appears to be the result of a casual conversation among sailors. The sophistication of the operation impressed and disturbed Sarah in equal measure. She had been outmaneuvered by people who understood the game better than she did, despite her years of training and experience. Mr. Smith reopened his file folder. Now that we have confirmation of your operational status, we need to decide how to proceed. Your presence in a conventional Navy unit was always intended to be temporary, but recent developments have accelerated our timeline. Sarah realized that her quiet life as Petty Officer Martinez was over, regardless of which option she chose. The question now was whether her next assignment would allow her to continue serving her country, or whether she had become too much of a liability to remain in active operations. The meeting continued for several more hours, covering details and implications that would reshape Sarah's life in ways she was only beginning to understand. By the time she was returned to regular duty, the sun was setting and the base was beginning to empty as personnel headed home or to off-base entertainment. Chief Williams was waiting for her when she returned to her duty station, his expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. Everything all right, Martinez? Sarah looked at the man who had been her supervisor and, in many ways, a mentor for the past 2 years. In a few days, she would receive new orders that would take her away from this base, and these people forever. Her cover identity would be retired, and Petty Officer Sarah Martinez would simply disappear from the Navy's rolls. Everything's fine, Chief, she replied, knowing it was the last lie she would tell him. Just routine security questions. Williams nodded, but his expression suggested he suspected there was more to the story than she was revealing. He had been around the military long enough to recognize when someone was about to disappear into the classified world that operated alongside, but separate from the conventional military. As Sarah cleaned out her locker that evening, she reflected on the events that had led to this moment. A casual question about kill counts had unraveled years of careful operational planning and forced her to confront the reality that her double life was unsustainable. The number, 347, had seemed like such a small thing to reveal. Just digits spoken in a moment of irritation. But those digits represented a decade of operations that officially didn't exist, missions carried out in the shadow world where the United States protected its interests through means that could never be acknowledged publicly. Now that number was out in the open, and Sarah was beginning to understand that some secrets were too dangerous to ever tell, even when keeping them demanded a lifetime of lies and isolation. Her phone buzzed with a text message containing new orders and a reporting date. In 72 hours, she would leave this base and this identity behind forever, stepping back into the shadow world that had shaped her into something far more dangerous than her fellow sailors could ever imagine. The quiet sailor they called Ghost was about to disappear, replaced by someone whose very existence was classified at levels that most people would never know existed. Sarah's final 72 hours as Petty Officer Martinez passed in a blur of routine duties and careful goodbyes that couldn't reveal their true nature. She went through the motions of her regular assignment while internally preparing for a transition that would erase this chapter of her life completely. The new orders had been delivered through channels so classified that even receiving them required special security protocols. She was to report to a nondescript office building in Norfolk, Virginia, where her next assignment would be explained in detail. The brief instructions made it clear that Petty Officer Sarah Martinez would officially be transferred to a routine administrative position, while the person behind that identity would be doing something entirely different. Chief Williams had been watching her with increasing concern over the past few days, clearly sensing that something significant was happening despite her attempts to maintain normalcy. His 20 years of military experience had taught him to recognize when someone was preparing to disappear into the classified world that operated parallel to conventional military service. On her last morning at the base, Williams called her into his office one final time. The small space felt different now, charged with unspoken understanding about the conversation they couldn't have. "I've been thinking about our discussion the other day," he said carefully, "about your service record and the discrepancies between what's officially documented and what's actually happened." Sarah remained silent, knowing that anything she said would only confirm his suspicions about her impending departure. Williams leaned back in his chair, studying her with those sharp eyes that had seen through so many carefully constructed facades over the years. "I've been in the Navy long enough to know that some sailors serve in ways that never make it into official records. I've also learned that when those sailors move on, they don't usually leave forwarding addresses." The statement hung in the air between them, an acknowledgement of realities that couldn't be spoken directly. Sarah appreciated his discretion and his understanding, even as she regretted that their professional relationship was ending this way. "I want you to know," Williams continued, "that you've been one of the best sailors I've ever supervised. Whatever your real story is, wherever you're going, you've served with honor and distinction here." The unexpected praise affected Sarah more than she had anticipated. For 2 years, Williams had been her link to normal military life, treating her as just another sailor despite whatever suspicions he might have harbored about her background. "Thank you, Chief," she replied quietly. "That means more than you know." Williams nodded and extended his hand. "Good luck, Martinez. Wherever the Navy sends you next, they're getting someone special." The handshake lasted longer than usual, carrying the weight of a goodbye that couldn't be acknowledged openly. As Sarah left his office for the final time, she felt a genuine sadness about leaving behind one of the few authentic relationships she had managed to build while maintaining her cover identity. The drive to Norfolk took her through familiar Virginia countryside, past bases, and installations that had been part of her life for the better part of a decade. Each mile brought her closer to a future that would be built on the foundation of her true capabilities rather than the carefully constructed limitations of her cover identity. The office building where she was to report looked like any of 1,000 similar structures that housed government contractors and administrative offices throughout the D.C. metro area. Only the sophisticated security measures and the quality of the surveillance systems hinted at its true purpose. Agent Morrison was waiting for her in the lobby, his professional demeanor unchanged from their previous meeting. "Ms. Martinez," he said with a formal nod, "thank you for your punctuality. There are several people who are eager to meet with you." The elevator carried them past the floors marked with ordinary business, names to levels that required additional security clearance to access. When the doors opened, Sarah found herself in a facility that looked nothing like the innocuous office building she had entered. The secure conference room was larger than the one at her previous base, with communication equipment and display screens that suggested this was where serious planning and coordination took place. 3 people were waiting for her, and their presence immediately made clear that her situation was more significant than she had realized. The first person to speak was a woman in her 50s wearing the uniform of a Navy admiral. Her bearing and the deference shown by the other personnel in the room made it clear that she was the senior authority present. "Ms. Martinez, I'm Admiral Catherine Parker. I oversee certain special programs within naval intelligence." Her introduction was carefully worded to avoid specifics while establishing her authority. Please, have a seat. We have a great deal to discuss. The second person was introduced as Colonel James Harrison from Defense Intelligence Agency, a man in his 40s whose civilian clothes couldn't disguise his military background. The third was Dr. Elizabeth Chun, whose credentials identified her as a senior analyst with the Central Intelligence Agency. The presence of representatives from 3 different intelligence agencies suggested that Sarah's situation had implications far beyond simple personnel management. Someone at the highest levels of the intelligence community was taking a direct interest in her case. Admiral Parker opened a thick file folder and spread several documents across the table. Even upside down, Sarah could see that they contained detailed information about operations she had thought were permanently buried in classified archives. Let's start with Operation Nightfall, Admiral Parker said, referencing an assignment Sarah had completed 3 years earlier. Your mission report indicated 37 confirmed eliminations over a 6-week period in Syria. Excellent work, by all accounts. The casual mention of classified information in front of multiple agencies indicated that Sarah's security status was being reviewed at levels far above anything she had previously experienced. These were people who had access to information that even she wasn't supposed to know about certain aspects of her own missions. Colonel Harrison leaned forward. Operation Ghostwind in Afghanistan resulted in 41 confirmed kills and the successful extraction of high-value intelligence assets. Your performance evaluation from that mission was exemplary. Dr. Chun consulted her own files. Operations Shadow Dancer, Night Eye, and Whisperwind account for another 114 confirmed eliminations. All missions completed with no civilian casualties and minimal collateral damage. Sarah listened as they recounted her operational history with clinical precision, reducing years of dangerous missions to statistics and performance metrics. Each operation they mentioned brought back memories of faces, places, and moments that she had tried to compartmentalize and file away. The total from your documented missions, Admiral Parker concluded, comes to 293 confirmed kills. That leaves 54 unaccounted for, based on the number you revealed at the bar. The mathematical precision of their analysis was unsettling. Sarah realized that they had been tracking her activities more closely than she had ever suspected, maintaining detailed records of operations that were supposed to be deniable and untraceable. The missing 54, she said carefully, come from operations that were conducted under different authorities. Missions that may not be reflected in Navy files. Colonel Harrison nodded as if this explanation matched his own assessment. Joint operations with other agencies, presumably. Missions where you were operating under borrowed or assumed identities. The confirmation that they knew about her inter-agency assignments was another indication of just how thoroughly her background was being examined. The walls between different intelligence organizations were apparently less solid than she had believed. Dr. Chin spoke for the first time since the introductions. What we're trying to understand, MS. Martinez, is how someone with your operational profile ended up serving in a conventional Navy unit under what appears to be a standard cover identity. The question went to the heart of an issue that Sarah herself had been grappling with for months. Her assignment to regular Navy duties had been presented as temporary, but it had stretched on far longer than originally planned. I was told it was a cooling-off period, she replied honestly. Time to decompress and maintain a lower profile while new assignments were being developed. Admiral Parker consulted another document. That cooling-off period has lasted 18 months, longer than any previous assignment to conventional duties in your record. The observation carried an implicit question about whether her extended assignment to regular duty had been intentional or the result of administrative oversight. Sarah had wondered about this herself, but had never been given a clear explanation. Colonel Harrison pulled out a tablet and displayed what appeared to be a world map with various locations marked in different colors. We've been tracking global requirements for personnel with your specific skill set. The demand has increased significantly over the past 2 years. The map showed conflict zones and areas of strategic interest scattered across multiple continents. Sarah could see patterns that suggested ongoing operations in places where the United States wasn't officially engaged in military activities. The question, Dr. Chin said, is whether you're ready to return to active special operations or whether your extended assignment to conventional duties indicates a desire to transition to a different type of service. It was the first time anyone had suggested that she might have a choice in her next assignment. For years, her operational assignments had been handed down without discussion or alternatives. Admiral Parker studied Sarah's expression carefully. Your revelation at the bar has created an opportunity for us to have this conversation. Your cover identity as a regular sailor is blown, but that opens up possibilities that weren't available while you were maintaining that cover. The room fell silent as Sarah considered the implications of what was being offered. For the first time in years, she was being given input into her own future rather than simply being assigned to whatever mission required her skills. "What are the options?" she asked. Colonel Harrison activated the display screen and brought up an organizational chart that showed various units and programs within the intelligence community. Option 1 is return to full operational status with enhanced authority and resources. You'd be working directly with joint task forces on high-priority targets. The prospect of returning to the work she had trained for was appealing, but Sarah was also aware of the costs that came with such assignments. Years of operational stress and isolation had taken a toll that she was only beginning to understand. Dr. Chun highlighted a different section of the organizational chart. Option 2 is transition to a training and development role. Your operational experience would be invaluable in preparing the next generation of special operations personnel. The teaching option offered a way to use her skills and experience while potentially having a more stable and sustainable lifestyle. But it also meant stepping away from active operations at a time when her capabilities were at their peak. Admiral Parker pointed to a third section of the chart. Option 3 is something entirely new. We're developing a program that combines active operations with strategic planning and interagency coordination. It would mean working at a higher level of authority, but with continued field assignments. The hybrid option sounded intriguing, offering the possibility of continued operational work while taking on additional responsibilities that could shape the direction of future missions. There's also option 4, Colonel Harrison said quietly. Complete withdrawal from special operations with assignment to a conventional intelligence role. It would mean the end of field work, but it would offer the possibility of a more normal life. The mention of a normal life struck Sarah unexpectedly. For so long, she had defined herself by her operational capabilities that the idea of stepping away from that identity was both frightening and strangely appealing. Admiral Parker gave her time to consider before continuing. Whatever you decide, it's important to understand that your revelation has changed the game in ways that go beyond just your own career. Other personnel in similar situations are being reevaluated based on the security implications of what happened. The revelation that her mistake had affected others was troubling. Sarah realized that her moment of anger at Jake Morrison's goading had created ripple effects throughout the special operations community. Dr. Chin pulled out another file. We've identified 17 other personnel who are serving under deep cover in conventional units. Your case has forced us to review whether such long-term cover assignments are sustainable from a security perspective. The scope of the review was larger than Sarah had imagined. Her individual case was apparently part of a broader examination of how special operations personnel were managed and deployed between active missions. Colonel Harrison leaned back in his chair. The traditional model of using conventional assignments as cover has worked for decades, but it's becoming increasingly difficult to maintain in an era of social media and informal information sharing. The reference to social media reminded Sarah of the phone cameras she had noticed at the bar during her revelation. In today's connected world, it was nearly impossible to keep significant information from spreading beyond its intended audience. Admiral Parker closed her file folder. We need a decision from you within 48 hours. Whatever you choose will serve as a model for how we handle similar situations going forward. The weight of responsibility was significant. Sarah's choice would influence not just her own future, but the careers and assignments of other personnel who found themselves in similar situations. As the meeting concluded, Sarah was escorted to temporary quarters where she could consider her options in privacy. The facility included secure communication equipment that would allow her to research the implications of each choice without compromising operational security. Alone in the spartly furnished room, Sarah reflected on the path that had brought her to this crossroads. The quiet sailor who had spent years maintaining an unremarkable cover identity was being offered the chance to step fully into the shadow world that had always been her true calling. The number 347 had seemed like such a small thing to reveal in a moment of irritation. Now she understood that it had been the key that unlocked a door she hadn't even known existed, leading to possibilities and responsibilities that would reshape not just her own future, but the entire structure of how the United States conducted its most sensitive operations. Outside her window, the Norfolk skyline stretched toward the horizon, a reminder of the conventional world she had spent years trying to fit into. Soon, she would have to choose whether to return to that world in a new capacity or step fully into the shadows where her true capabilities could be utilized without the constraints of maintaining a false identity. The decision would define not just her own future, but potentially influence how an entire generation of special operations personnel would be trained, deployed, and managed in an increasingly connected and transparent world. Sarah spent the first night in her temporary quarters staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep as she wrestled with the weight of the decision before her. Each option represented a fundamentally different path, not just for her career, but for her identity and her understanding of who she was beyond the missions and the kill count that had defined her for so long. By morning, she had requested additional information about each option, and Admiral Parker had arranged for her to speak with personnel who had experience in the different roles being offered. The first conversation was with Commander Lisa Rodriguez, a woman who had made the transition from active operations to training and development 3 years earlier. Rodriguez met her in a secure conference room, carrying herself with the confidence of someone who had found peace with her decision to step back from active field work. Her file showed an operational history almost as extensive as Sarah's, with missions spanning multiple continents and conflict zones. The hardest part, Rodriguez explained, isn't learning to teach others. It's learning to let go of the adrenaline, the sense of purpose that comes from active operations. For years, you define yourself by what you can do in the field. Teaching means finding a new way to define your value. Sarah appreciated the honesty. She had wondered whether stepping back from operations would feel like giving up or selling out, abandoning the work she had been trained to do at the highest levels. But there's satisfaction in it too, Rodriguez continued. Watching young operators develop the skills that might keep them alive, knowing that your experience is being passed on to people who need it. The impact is different, but it's real. The conversation lasted for over an hour, covering both the practical aspects of transitional to training roles and the psychological challenges of stepping away from active operations. Rodriguez was honest about the difficulties, but also conveyed a sense of fulfillment that came from her new position. The second conversation was with Colonel Michael Turner, who had chosen the hybrid option 2 years earlier and was now overseeing strategic coordination between multiple agencies while still participating in selected field operations. Turner's perspective was different, reflecting the challenges and opportunities of working at the intersection between active operations and strategic planning. His role required understanding not just individual missions, but the broader context of how those missions fit into national security objectives. The strategic level gives you a different perspective on the work we do, Turner explained. Instead of focusing on individual targets or specific objectives, you start seeing the patterns, the larger picture of how operations connect to policy goals. But the hybrid role also came with unique stresses, including the responsibility for making decisions that would affect multiple operations and personnel across different agencies. Turner was candid about the weight of sending others into situations similar to those he had faced as an operator. You still get to do field work, he said, but now you also carry the responsibility for the bigger picture. Sometimes that makes the individual missions harder because you understand the full cost and complexity of what's being attempted. The third conversation was the most surprising. Dr. Sarah Kim had left active operations 5 years earlier to take a conventional intelligence role, transitioning completely away from fieldwork to become an analyst and strategic planner. Kim's perspective challenged some of Sarah's assumptions about what leaving operations would mean for her sense of purpose and identity. Rather than feeling like she had stepped back from important work, Kim described her transition as moving to a different type of critical contribution. I thought I was giving up the real work, Kim admitted. But analysis and strategic planning turned out to be just as important, just in different ways. The skills you develop as an operator, attention to detail, ability to read situations quickly, understanding of how operations actually work, those transfer directly to intelligence analysis. More importantly, Kim had found that her operational background gave her credibility and insight that analysts without field experience often lacked. Her recommendations carried weight because decision-makers knew she understood the practical implications of the operations she was analyzing and planning. The transition was difficult, Kim acknowledged, but not in the ways I expected. The hardest part was learning to trust that my contributions were valuable even when I wasn't directly in the field. After completing these conversations, Sarah was given access to classified briefing materials that outlined the current strategic environment the types of missions that would be required in each of the roles being offered. The briefings painted a picture of an increasingly complex global security situation that would require different types of expertise and approaches. The active operations option would involve assignments in several ongoing conflict zones where the United States was engaged in undeclared activities. The missions would be similar to those she had completed in the past, but with enhanced resources and authority that reflected the growing importance of special operations in national security strategy. The training option would involve developing new curricula for special operations training, incorporating lessons learned from recent conflicts, and adapting to new types of threats. The role would also include evaluating and selecting candidates for advanced programs, drawing on her operational experience to identify personnel with the potential for specialized assignments. The hybrid option represented something entirely new in the intelligence community, a recognition that the traditional separation between operations and strategic planning was becoming less effective in addressing modern security challenges. Personnel in these roles would be expected to move fluidly between fieldwork and planning responsibilities. The conventional intelligence option would involve assignment to one of several analysis centers where her operational background would provide unique insights into the planning and execution of sensitive missions. The role would focus on strategic assessment and policy development rather than direct operational involvement. As Sarah reviewed the materials and reflected on her conversations with the other personnel, she began to understand that her decision was about more than just choosing her next assignment. The intelligence community was evolving, and her choice would help determine the direction of that evolution. Late on the second day, Admiral Parker requested a final meeting before Sarah's decision deadline. The Admiral appeared tired, as if she had been dealing with similar conversations and decisions throughout the week. "Before you make your final choice," Admiral Parker said, "there's something else you need to understand about the broader context of this situation." She activated the secure display system and brought up a series of documents that Sarah recognized as after-action reports from recent operations around the world. The reports painted a picture of increasing complexity in global security challenges that was straining traditional approaches to intelligence and operations. "We're facing a fundamental shift in the nature of the threats we deal with," Admiral Parker explained. "Traditional nation-state conflicts are becoming less common, but we're seeing more situations that require sustained, sophisticated responses that combine intelligence, operations, and strategic coordination." The briefing materials showed how recent operations had succeeded or failed based on the quality of coordination between different agencies and the ability to adapt quickly to changing situations. Sarah could see how her own missions had been part of larger strategic efforts that she had only partially understood at the time. "Your generation of operators has experience that we can't afford to lose to routine attrition," Admiral Parker continued. "The question is how to best utilize that experience in an evolving security environment." The Admiral paused the briefing and looked directly at Sarah. "Your revelation at the bar has given us an opportunity to have conversations that should have happened years ago. We've been managing talent like yours on an ad hoc basis, without really thinking strategically about how to develop and utilize your capabilities." The admission that the intelligence community had been operating without a clear strategic vision for personnel development was sobering. Sarah realized that her individual decision was part of a broader effort to create more systematic approaches to career development for special operations personnel. Admiral Parker brought up a new document that outlined proposed changes to how the intelligence community would manage personnel transitions and career development. The proposals were clearly based on lessons learned from Sarah's case and similar situations. "Whatever you decide, you won't be the last person to face this choice," Admiral Parker said. "We're developing new pathways that will allow personnel to move more fluidly between different types of assignments based on their interests, capabilities, and the strategic needs of the community." The conversation continued for another hour, covering both the immediate implications of Sarah's choice and the longer-term changes that were being implemented across multiple agencies. By the end, Sarah understood that her decision would serve as a pilot case for new approaches to personnel management that could affect hundreds of other operators over the coming years. That evening, Sarah made her decision. The choice had crystallized during her conversation with Admiral Parker, as she recognized that the hybrid option represented the best opportunity to contribute to the evolution of the intelligence community while continuing to utilize her operational skills. The next morning, she met with Admiral Parker to formally accept the hybrid role. The Admiral seemed pleased with the choice, confirming that it matched her own assessment of the best fit for Sarah's background and capabilities. You'll start with a 6-month orientation period that will include both strategic planning assignments and continued operational readiness training, Admiral Parker explained. The goal is to develop your understanding of the broader context while maintaining your field capabilities. The orientation would be followed by assignment to a newly created joint task force that would coordinate special operations activities across multiple agencies and geographic regions. Sarah would be one of the first personnel to serve in this type of role, making her both a test case and a model for future assignments. Over the following weeks, Sarah began her transition into the new role. The orientation was more challenging than she had expected, requiring her to learn new skills while maintaining her operational edge. She found herself studying strategic planning documents during the day and training in advanced combat techniques in the evenings. The most difficult aspect of the transition was learning to think beyond individual missions to consider broader strategic objectives and long-term consequences. Years of focusing on specific targets and immediate objectives had to be balanced with understanding how those actions fit into larger policy goals. But there were also unexpected rewards. For the first time in her career, Sarah had access to the full context of the missions she had completed, understanding how her individual actions had contributed to broader strategic successes. The knowledge was both satisfying and sobering, revealing the true scope of the work she had been doing. 3 months into her orientation, Sarah received an assignment that would test her new hybrid role. A complex situation had developed in Eastern Europe that required coordination between multiple agencies and the deployment of specialized personnel with both operational and analytical capabilities. The mission would involve working with foreign intelligence services, managing local assets, and coordinating with conventional military forces, all while maintaining the flexibility to engage in direct action if circumstances required it. It was exactly the type of complex, multifaceted challenge that the hybrid role had been designed to address. As Sarah prepared for her first mission in her new capacity, she reflected on the path that had brought her to this point. The number she had revealed in anger at a bar had set in motion changes that were reshaping how the intelligence community managed its most valuable personnel. The quiet sailor who had maintained a cover identity for years was gone, replaced by someone who could operate openly at the intersection of intelligence and operations. The transition hadn't been easy, but it had opened possibilities that she hadn't known existed. Her new role would allow her to continue serving her country while helping to develop the next generation of approaches to national security challenges. The kill count that had defined her past would become just one element of a more complex and sophisticated career that combined operational excellence with strategic thinking. The shadow world she had operated in for years was evolving, and she was helping to shape that evolution. The responsibilities were greater, but so were the opportunities to make a meaningful contribution to the security of the United States and its allies. As she boarded the aircraft that would take her to her first assignment in the new role, Sarah understood that her career was entering a new phase that would be defined not just by her individual capabilities, but by her ability to help bridge the gap between operations and strategy in an increasingly complex global security environment.